In the previous video, we asked the question, so what is so special about the walls of the GIT organs? Hi, and welcome to our video. Thank you for joining us. Well, this is what is so special about the walls of these tubes. Histologically, the walls of the organs of the GIT have the same four layers: a mucosa, a submucosa, a muscularis, and an adventitial or serosal layer. Warning, we are now entering a discussion about GIT histology. The mucosal layer is the layer which makes contact with the lumen of the GIT. The mucosal layer has three components: the lining epithelium, the lamina propria, a thin layer of smooth muscle called the muscularis mucosa, not to be confused with the muscularis layer. The submucosa is the layer which makes contact and is wrapped concentrically around the mucosal layer. It consists of dense irregular connective tissue, blood vessels, lymphatics, as well as nerve branches. The two aforementioned layers vary the most between the individual organs. The muscularis layer is the layer which is sandwiched between the submucosa and the adventitia. It, the muscularis layer, is made of, you guessed it, muscle. However, it is in fact made up of two different layers of muscle tissue, the difference between which is the arrangement of the muscle tissue around the lumen and at times, mostly in the esophagus, the type of muscle out of which they are made. The two muscle layers of the muscularis layer are the inner circular layer and the outer longitudinal layer. Contraction of the inner layer causes constriction of the lumen so that the lumen becomes smaller, and contraction of the external layer makes the lumen shorter. The outermost external layer and final layer, which makes up the walls of the organ, makes contact with the peritoneum, and it is called the adventitia for some organs or the serosa for others. So what is adventitia and what is serosa? Well, adventitia is the layer of connective tissue which surrounds the muscularis layer of the alimentary tract. It is made up of connective tissue and is traversed by blood cells, nerves, and lymphatics as they pass. The serosa can be defined as adventitia, which is covered by mesothelium. Now let us take a look at the individual organs and how this histology looks different for each other. In keeping with our trend of ignoring the mouth, which helps you chew and facilitates the process of food digestion and the creation of food boluses, we shall not be discussing the mouth and oral cavity. However, the best place to start remains the beginning. And so, our discussion shall begin with the next best thing, with a look at the esophagus. So what do we know about the esophagus? Well, we know that it extends from the thorax to the abdomen and that it enters the abdomen at the level of the 10th thoracic vertebrae, T10. We also know that it extends from the pharynx to the stomach and that when we eat, it conveys a food bolus. How does it do this though? Well, believe it or not, food does not simply free fall from your mouth to your stomach. The esophagus conveys food through a series of peristaltic movements. Peristalsis is a very popular activity among the organs of the GIT and is a fancy word for a series of contractions and relaxations which are meant to move a substance, in the case of the esophagus, a food bolus, from one place to the next. How it works is that one part of the esophagus, the part usually proximal to the food bolus, contracts, and the part of the esophagus which is distal to that food bolus relaxes to receive the food bolus. We can liken this to a series of people who are standing in a line and passing a single ball down the line. The person throwing the ball wraps their hands around the ball, and the one catching it opens their hands to catch the ball. Not everyone is throwing simultaneously and attempting to catch simultaneously, because the ball would remain in the same place and not going anywhere. Therefore, Peristaltic movement needs to be coordinated. When peristaltic movements are not well coordinated, then swallowing difficulties or dysphagia may occur. An example of this is hyperactive diseases of the esophagus. Most healthy people do not have difficulty swallowing food. Why is this? Well, this is because in most individuals, the mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and the adventitia or serosa of the esophagus have been designed to perform the function of the esophagus. The esophagus, especially the upper parts, are exposed to the outside, different temperatures, and we eat different foods of different compositions, consistencies, and amounts, and yet all of this food has to pass through the esophagus successfully. What this means for the esophagus is that it needs to have a histological composition which will allow it to heal quickly after abrasion, expand according to the amount of food we are eating, within reasonable limits, of course, initiate the action of swallowing under voluntary control while continuing the rest of the process of swallowing and digestion from there on without our active thought and participation. That seems like a tall order. So, how is the esophagus exactly suited? Well, the esophagus has a mucosa of stratified squamous epithelial cells, which are renowned for their ability to protect underlying tissue from exposure, as well as for their increased cell turnover, allowing rapid healing when they are damaged, at least in comparison to other forms of tissue. Additionally, the lamina propria contains mucosal glands. The submucosa of the esophagus is quite typical of the GIT, and it also contains submucosal tubular acinar glands. One of the functions of these glands, as well as those which are found in the mucosal layer, is that they secrete mucus which lubricates the surface of the esophagus. Well, can you imagine dry food sliding down a dry esophagus? Ouch! In the undisturbed or empty esophagus, the mucosal and submucosal layers of the esophagus are also folded in longitudinal folds, and as the food passes through the esophagus, these folds disappear, meaning the esophagus expands and the esophagus becomes a tube with a smooth lumen which is able to accommodate whatever food you have eaten. In the muscularis layer of the esophagus, it varies according to the segment of the esophagus which is being discussed. In the upper 1/3 of the esophagus, the muscularis layer is made up of 2 layers of skeletal muscle, an inner circular layer and an outer circular layer, which is longitudinal in orientation. In the middle 1/3 section of the esophagus, the muscularis layer is made up of different layers, an inner circular layer of skeletal muscle, and an outer longitudinal layer of smooth muscle. In the distal 1/3 of the esophagus, the muscularis layer of the esophagus consists of 2 layers of smooth muscle tissue. Whew, that was a lot. So what do we know so far? Well, we know that the GIT is a series of consecutive tubes which have been adapted to perform the important functions of food digestion, absorption, immune defense, and waste excretion, among many others. We also know that the GIT consists of the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, and the rectum. We know that the walls of these organs are similar in composition and consist mainly of 4 layers: the mucosa, submucosa, and the muscularis, as well as the adventitia or serosa. We know that although they share a generalized structure of layers, each of these layers has been adapted to suit the function of the organ. We also know that the GIT has its functions supported by the accessory organs, which are the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. We also took a brief look at the esophagus and its histology, and how this histology helps the esophagus perform its function optimally. But we still have other organs to discuss and their functions to discuss. For this video, It's a wrap, pun intended. Goodbye.